Welcome to GovCon Unscripted, where we dive into the unfiltered stories and strategies from all around the world of government contracting. Join host Chelsea Roberts as she explores how to navigate, thrive, and win in this complex but lucrative industry.
All right. Hey, everyone, and welcome back to GovCon Unscripted. I'm your host, Chelsea Roberts, CEO of Collaborative Compositions. And today I've got with us Doug Averill, global industry leader in government contracting. Doug, who are you and what do you do?
So as you said, Chelsea, I am Doug Averill. I have spent about half of my career as a government employee, the other half in technology. And I guess strapline, broad brush, really always focused on people, process, technology in government. And effectively, what are best practices? What's working? How do we support that? At Pega, I've got a team of folks across the globe, and we're really focused on cloud compliance, product roadmap, sort of policy, what's trending, what are all the things that effectively help, in this case, Pega systems and technology really be well-tuned to deliver great outcomes in government. So that's, at least professionally, how I'd answer that question.
Interesting. And now, technology and government, the words are not necessarily synonymous with each other. And it's not always that the government is on the leading edge of technology. I think that I've seen some efforts to modernize, bring things a bit farther forward into the future. But in terms of things like AI, it seems like that technology is changing really rapidly and faster than the government can keep up. So I'm curious, in your experience, what you've seen in terms of AI implementation, what's happening, what's working, what's failing, and how that kind of works within the government ecosystem.
It's really been a fascinating couple of years to watch. So let me pull back a second and say, for years at Pega, I've been really fortunate to have a team and some amazing transformation happening across Australia and New Zealand. And whenever I would go there, I would always say it was like a look 5 years into the future about how transformation was going to happen in the rest of the world. And I think theories about that, it's the GDP and the size of government and everything else. It can move rapidly. They also have this really interesting ability culturally to come in and out of professional into government and back again. There's no stigma. There's no sort of deep retirement. There's a lot more fungibility there. I have seen this complete flip-flop from Australia leading and the US sort of lagging in terms of technology uptake to now Australia is struggling with this, and it's not the technology. It's really process and policy that is slowing this down. And I'm seeing a real uptake in the US. So in the early year and a half ago, new administration, there was a huge push on AI. And I think everyone was doing it at the time. I certainly witnessed that on the commercial side here at Pega. It was like we were starting to make sure everyone was using these large language models, that we were using agents at work. We weren't really looking at why, but we wanted to make sure that people were like starting to put fingers on keyboard and take this car around the block. Totally get that was what the US federal government and a lot of state governments were starting to do, is we have to bring AI into everything. And in fact, I look at Secretary Duffy's mandate about a year ago, nothing's going to go live without an AI component. I think that was bold. In a lot of ways, it really helped drive some new thinking about, okay, if I have to use it, how am I going to use it? And we started off seeing things like, we're just going to kind of blow through tokens. And then people are saying, whoa. Let's not use it for everything. Let's figure out what we should use it for. Right. So I see this really, frankly, coming into the end of this US federal fiscal year through the summer, starting to pull back a year into this, a year and a half into this, saying, okay, we got a lot of agencies, a lot of programs using AI. We're starting to understand how the workforce is going to use AI. So what are the outcomes that we actually want to drive from that? Because it's gone from AI can do everything. It's going to come automate everything end-to-end in government. Yeah. It's just a really powerful tool. They're not measuring how many people used Word on a given day or Excel. It's just a tool on your desktop. Now, AI is obviously a massively powerful tool, but it feels like we're starting to settle into, okay, how do we want to rationalize our portfolio work, our procurement around these things, as well as the people in the contracting ecosystem around it. So it's just very undone, but it feels like it's starting to land a little bit.
Interesting. And I personally have experienced, first of all, running out of tokens, which nobody wants to do with your AI tools. And that's like, no, don't make me wait longer. But in my experience, I get the sense that it's this way with government as well. It's like we tried to implement it in a lot of ways, in a lot of use cases. We found some that worked, some that didn't. But it's less being looked at from more of a holistic perspective of, okay, how are we going to thoughtfully build these things into our workflows? And more of like I'm making this one thing easier for myself, and that's the extent of it. And it doesn't necessarily blend or merge into anybody else's workflow or their portfolio or their understanding. And in my experience, personally being a little bit vulnerable here, I have taken a little bit of time to try to basically outline some things that I would consider to be an operating system for all of the different tasks I've got, and trying to outline all of the different things that I've got that I need to do, and then saying, okay, these things are the most likely to be successful with an AI tool and an AI assistant. And then these things, they clearly need to stay in my bucket. Do you see that being the approach that the government is taking, or how are they looking at it from an implementation perspective? Is it just hodgepodge, or is there anybody saying all across the board, everybody doing document template creation will now use AI tools for? How does that look?
Yeah, it's happening. Yes to all of that. Right? And because this is this tender time when we're crossing over from AI is going to solve everything to what are the outcomes AI is going to help us to deliver. So mileage may vary, be the answer to that I'm seeing across the US federal government. And where I'm really seeing the best outcomes is where we're not just looking, it's not so much sort of the enterprise architecture where everyone should use this model for this. It's much more around how are we looking at all the different systems and programs across a life cycle or across a major department, and how are we starting to stitch that workflow together to make sure that from the initial touch to the final outcome, that things are happening well. The initial or current problem with AI generally, when you sort of agentic models that we're using in government, is it doesn't yet currently have the level of context that's required to be able to fully understand what a program does. And as we all know, and your listeners know, we have silos in government, not because anyone wants a silo, but because we appropriate money and we direct policy that way. So here's money, go deliver this outcome. But this outcome was just part of an entire life cycle. So now we're sort of bridging across these things. Where the human is absolutely critical and where I'm seeing success is much more pulling back and saying, what is it that sort of end-to-end customer journey look like? And then how do we use these rapid prototyping, rapid piloting tools to build something, model the outcome across these different systems, and then get cultural buy-in to get all the people who own these different things to both realize and appreciate and get bought in that their modernization journey is going to be part of a bigger end-to-end thing, really. And ultimately, I think that's why we come back to where do humans fit in a world of AI and government? It's always making sure that there's context and almost like repping the citizen or repping the worker across that journey. And AI and LLM is not going to ensure that the right outcome was achieved. It's just going to do their part within the context it has.
Interesting. And I can say that's probably spot on. I have to give my AI tools an abundant amount of context so that they know just about everything that they could possibly need to know. Because if there's any little gap, even just the smallest gap, it will take advantage of that gap and just blow outside of the entire thing that I'm just trying to achieve and accomplish. And I'm like, you just don't even to think about those, like the little teeny tiny bits of context that you have.
I was vibe coding. I was sitting there with Claude a couple hours on a Saturday. I was building an app. And one of the steps in the app was to take a picture from my phone and to upload it to Gemini and return how many calories was in it. It was building a calorie tracking app. And I did this for a few hours and it was working great. And I was bugging it, mocking it up, and I was getting ready to push it. And it started having problems. So I said, show me the prompt. And it was said, here's the prompt I'm sending to Claude. And within just a couple of hours, it had lost complete context of something that I'd done with it in the same stream. And I think if that's the level of context it doesn't have, it needs such small bites, how is it going to understand, even with MCP and everything else, what is going across the totality of something like Social Security or the Internal Revenue, or do you know what I mean? Those are massively complicated things.
Yeah.
You have to have people in there who are really advocating for how policy should be enacted and how workflows should happen.
And that is one of the hardest parts in my experience, trying to make sure that the process and that the actual workflow that you go through to achieve some of these outcomes is understood by the people that are trying to give the machine context to begin with. And when I've tried to sit down and outline my processes step by step, I was giving it to a person to follow, and I realized, okay, my steps are missing some things in there. In my mind, this makes sense to go from step 1 to step 2 to step 3, but in reality, there's like a 1 3/4 step that I'm just missing in there. And I'm just not giving that because it doesn't occur to me. That's not something that would follow naturally or lead on naturally to a person, let alone an AI tool. And so I'm curious, like, how do workflows or processes have been established? And some of these things are really like well ingrained. They've been in there for years, if not decades, and going on longer. How do those things, is it just about like providing that same workflow the way it's always been done to the AI tool to give it, is that good enough? Or it's a process of redesigning?
It's absolutely the redesigning, but it's a whole different way of doing it in new data sources. So one of the things that has been fascinating to me is Pega has this tool called Blueprint, and we actually have a FedRAMP High version of it called Blueprint for Government. And what it effectively allows you to do is take artifacts that exist anywhere in the world. So policy manual, existing code from your current application. I even go back to the Federal Register. Those become uploadable artifacts to reimagine a workflow. So what I see people doing all the time is you'll start with, I need it to do this and this. We'll pull back and say, upload the source policy document and say, what was the intent of this? Because what we see is actually gaps in execution from the original policy. So if you're paving the cow path, you're going to get that again, and might skip steps, it might be incompliant, and definitely suboptimal. So the key in this is to be able to take the source of what was the intent of this, but this is where it's really successful, is not to then throw it over the wall, give it to someone to come back and say, reimagine my workflows, but put the people who are actually doing the work, those power users, in the middle of that. So this is, and I see this increasingly, people's lunch hours, they'll take the second half of the day, they'll sit down as a small group and work on the next step of automation. And the key, like I said, is to take the source document, say, what could this look like? And say, I wasn't thinking of it that way, but that would be interesting. What you're doing is already moving from sort of pilot prototype into building an application. And you're building an application with the people who are then going to have to drive the adoption of that application, and therefore really getting an early hook into the cultural change management that's going to come with that. They're the ones that are going back and repping the viability of this new application, not saying, oh boy, what are we going to have to learn? And then I've seen plenty of applications that are not built that way. The real old ones, the onboarding new employees, 6, 12, 14 months to bring someone on, that's just to learn the application. If you're actually bringing people in the intuitive way or to an intuitive application, you're able to hire people quickly, onboard them, and get those outcomes quickly. So it's just a reimagination. That's design time AI. That's even separate from that token maxing runtime AI. It's just the reimagination. I'll just finish that with saying what I really like seeing in those situations is where sort of those seasoned policy people within the sort of the experts within those programs are saying, that's not how we would do it, but that's actually kind of interesting. We ought to think about doing it that way. It's just because they were there at the first inception of that idea. Right. It's one of those, it suddenly becomes a good idea, and it's a fresh way of thinking about a program.
And that's really interesting that you mentioned that, because recently I've had situations where I think the people in like that are trying to go through the process, they are new, they're very green, and they are strictly and pretty much solely going by the policy documents. Like they go to the FAR, they go to their supplement, and they say, okay, I have to do these things and I must have these things in place for me to be able to proceed through this process, whatever that process may be. And in some cases, it seems that like the policy, like granted, I give all the credit in the world for the revolutionary FAR overhaul and all of the work that's going on there to try to simplify and modernize some of those policy things. But I also see at the same time that there is some rigidity that is implemented and followed by way of that policy documentation. And I'm just curious, do you think that the policy is going to change, adjust, adapt to accommodate things that may be a little bit more flexible, or may need some more flexibility in them, or some more creativity in them? Or is it just going to be strictly, this is the policy, this is what we go by, and there is no way but interpretation about it?
Yeah, creativity in public procurement always makes me a little nervous, but I think your point in sort of rethinking, reasserting, reassessing, it's going to happen. I see contracting currently as either happening really quickly when there's a contracting event because there's so much pressure on that contracting officer to go through a backlog that they're trying to push with good intent, working very hard, but they've just got to push through. And then there are other programs where things are just frozen because unless they're going to do it the same old, kind of the same policy way, nothing happens. I don't know that either one of those are ideal in my view. I think this is a question of automating a lot of the things that can be automating, bringing new tools like very localized, often not frontier AI models, but local models that allow them to source recommendations around where are some risky things. What do we actually want to dig in? It's not a matter of reading 500 pages end to end. Let's focus on the places where there might be risk and someone who has a warrant really needs to focus. I do think over all of this, and I agree with you, it's been a refreshing rewrite, simplification in a lot of ways so far. I believe we've got a lot longer to go, but I think of those things over the next year or so are really going to be sussed out by where the bottlenecks are and how we cut through them. So what does a post-OneGov world look like? We've gone from ramp contracts and sort of bulk buys to how do we then actually transact things? And I go back to the tried and true roller coaster of OTAs. We use them, don't use them. There's a real push on OTAs, but at the end of the day, and I've seen OTAs work in a lot of different ways, you can move quickly, but it doesn't mean that quickly is getting you the outcome that you needed through that. So in a lot of ways, I come back to how do we get the right people in the room to define what it is that we need? How do we set up sort of an aspirational multi-year roadmap, even multi-administration roadmap of things that we would like to do? And then how do we pull back and actually cut through those things? Using an OTA is great, but it should be the first step on be a multi-year transformational journey, ensuring you have the right tools that go with the right people and the right process.
And that's, I think, one of the hardest parts here is like those right people, a lot of them, I'm not sure are even in the government anymore, let alone in the right rooms for the right conversations. There was so much cutting of staff and reduction of force, and so many people just decided to take the early retirement packages and so forth. There was that fork in the road that we all saw last year. And it brings me to the question of, are there enough people in this ecosystem that know what the right sort of answers are, or at least have that procurement experience and that context to be able to help guide and shape some of these things, or have they mostly left?
Yeah, so it feels like they've mostly left. I don't know that, but it certainly feels like that. I think that my view is that there's going to have to be a sort of a rehiring right sizing. There was an over reduction and then there's sort of a build back. I remember from years in government, people are saying, we've got to reduce headcount. How do we do that? Typically, there's a reduction in headcount. It's somewhat painful, and then you rebuild to what it is that you need to. And I believe that there's going to be a rebuilding around that. But an automation, a lot of things that can be automated. Again, I think that the FAR rewrite is allowing for some more flexibility. There's going to be rethinking around that. But overall, no, there aren't enough people. Are there enough people in the ecosystem? I don't know, but ultimately that is the question. We're going to have to find those people and pull them in and give them the tools. And frankly, I go back to what I was saying a minute ago about reimagining the process of contracting in this case generally is how do we actually go back to source material? How do we actually create a process that is modern, easy to use, but also highly efficient and compliant? We want creativity, but maybe not at runtime. We want compliance largely. But once we're there, that's how we can staff up to something that's efficient. I'm sure you've seen, and I know your viewers and listeners have seen, if you're bringing someone in and having them read word for word 500 pages of the same document every day, you're going to work at the same speed. We have new tools now that are allowing us to cut through documents, to understand there are new processes, new ways of procuring things. And I still come back to procurement is key, but how are we making sure that procurement is driving or almost even ensuring that we're getting the outcomes that we need to modernize in government? Otherwise, we're just buying stuff and we're not actually moving the ball forward.
That comes back a little bit to what you were saying earlier about a backlog and all these people trying to work through significant backlogs of things that they are like building the plane as you're flying it. They're trying to reinvent and recreate and re-engineer some of these processes. But when it comes down to it, I think a lot of them are just taking the approach of, okay, I'm just going to feed an AI tool my process. I'm going to put all the documentation, everything that I need to go through it. And then that will help me get through this backlog faster, although it may not be in the most effective way or maybe the most efficient way, but they're probably seeing some time savings and how much they're able to get done and what they're able to push through. But it comes down to, are they building, are they rebuilding, are they rethinking these old processes, or are they just carrying those old processes that might not have the best aspects and they might not have the most effective ways of going about doing things? Are they just bringing those back into the new way of trying to do things? And does that old sort of carry over into the new? And is that a benefit?
Yeah, I mean, I think of a lot of like, it was the old days of find and replace. We're effectively using tools to just kind of cull through documents, try to be more efficient within the processes with what we have. So AI, incredibly powerful tool set, a lot of creative ways to use it, but the process is the process. And truly, until there's a little bit of time to step back and say, how do we want to rethink this? It's going to continue to just be cutting through backlogs, not actually driving efficiency through. That truly is what I believe is going to be happening later on in this year. Is the current mode is not really sustainable. And I have a huge amount of appreciation for those contracting officers who are still there. Thank you for the work that you all are doing, because it's incredibly important. We just need to think of new ways to be able to highlight if there are certain procurements of certain types and thresholds that we should spend a lot of time on, then let's spend a lot of time on them, but then let's cut through a lot of those sort of basic things and have straight through processing for some of the procurements. I think of one of the very large agencies that we worked with, where as they were doing a modernization with us around their call center, they actually wanted to increase average handling time by 10 minutes. And I thought that's a really strange metric. But what they were doing was actually driving almost all of the work as straight through processing and then pulling off the really specialized stuff to the really smart people who needed to just spend a lot of time with the people on the phone and kind of walk through things. I think that's a similar paradigm to how we are thinking and should be thinking about modernizing contracting. Is there's some big, difficult, hairy problems in contracting? Give that to the smart people, but give them time to actually go through it. There's a lot of stuff that just happens. Just push it through. I spent a lot of time in government managing accountants who would reconcile to the penny. I'm thinking, what is it costing us to reconcile to the penny?
Yeah. And I am the recipient at one point in my career of a 3-cent check for contract closeout, which is priority delivered by mail, by us or whatever. And I was just like, man, it is going to cost me more money to take us to the bank than it is actually worth to actually deal with and to issue. And that just shocks me every time. It's like, why are we dealing with such small? We don't even make the penny anymore. Come on. Like,
you make the penny spot on. That's it.
And so I'm curious, do you think that there is, I guess I've seen firsthand that there are countless pilots going on with AI tools. People are saying, okay, let's just bring it in. We'll trial and error. We'll get it in there really quickly, and then we'll see if it works. But then where does it go after that? Is it put into like a larger, like if it's successful, assuming that this is like you trial, it works really well, and then you want to get it into production with some of your more critical systems. How is that process working? Is it happening? Is that process working?
Depends on your risk appetite. And a really interesting thing that I'm seeing is how AI is impacting the software development lifecycle within government. And what it's effectively doing is you're generating a lot of point solutions
Right.
up front. And this is less so with automation. The work we're doing Pega tends to be much more complex, high volume, holistic work. But if you look at the Claude code, I'm going to go write something that's going to fix this problem. What it's doing is creating a lot of stuff, dropping it on the front door of IT, ringing the doorbell and running. And now everyone's saying, what am I supposed to do with this? I don't have context of where it fits. Who's touched this? How does it fit into the SDLC? So it's kind of squeezing the balloon into the tail end of how we get things from an idea to production. What I see happening, and this has been really a lot of the last 6-8 months at Pega is within government, is making sure that we're not just dropping things on the front porch of, but it's that combination of IT, because in this case, Pega is a platform that sits across government, that it runs at FedRAMP High as a lot do, and you can procure through ITMAS or Super, whatever you want. And now what we can do is say, we've got the procurement part initially sorted. Let's get everyone as part of that value chain in the room together. Let's go back to the source documents. Let's not build a pilot. Let's build a production app together, but let's start small. So now we're using design time AI to actually build something. We're getting the right people in the room. So we're getting the cultural change management up front. We're getting the people who are eventually going to use this. So not just people who think they know what's happening. Let's get someone from a regional field office in the room to say, yeah, that's actually how we do the work. Let's get them to rethink that work. And then let's go from pilot to production really quickly. And we will have done it with the CISO and the ISOs in the room so that they're already downstream of that and understand how they're going to be able to promote to production. As long as we have a procurement in place that can support that life cycle from the initial idea to actually promotion to production in an ATO, that's how you're going to get an outcome. And what we do is we still chunk, and this is going away in my view. I think we're really starting to rethink this, is how are we getting everyone in the room early? And then I would even see a COTAR or a CO in the room as part of that combination, say, okay, you're going from production, notwithstanding OTAs, but just the traditional ITMAS sort of procurement. How are we going to go from an idea to live in 90 days? Because everyone needs to turn their key, flip their switch, and go green for that to happen. That's a lot of others.
Right. And that's a lot of prioritization. So how do we make sure that we're prioritizing the right things at the right time to make sure that all of these things can happen in conjunction with each other to be able to enable that process to flow? Because at any given point in that, any one of those stakeholders can throw the whole thing up for grabs or just throw it out the window. And it can become just dead in the water just at that point when somebody goes on leave or you don't have the opportunity to get the attention of the people that you need, which that has to be one of the most frustrating things in government procurement for me is there is certainly nobody who has not one single person at least that have to be made for
by design, right?
It is by design, and there are reasons for that, but it does truly make it a more difficult and complex process to navigate and to go through just by way of different priorities, biases, preferences, perspectives, and having to make sure that everybody is on the same page. And I'm curious, how much pushback do you get in those conversations? Like, how many times is it somebody, you call them up and you're like, we're getting everybody in the room together, come on over. And how often are they just, no, I've got other things to do, I'd prefer not?
It's interesting because it's a great question. I hadn't really thought of it that way, but the answer is when you engage procurement up front, and when I say when government program owners bring procurement in for part of that journey early, almost exclusively they're appreciative of having been involved in that because they start knowing that it's coming. They know how to prioritize. They can give feedback. For the most part, I don't see procurement contracting ever wanting intentionally to be in the way to do things just because they need to do things. It's because they've got a warrant, because they're required to do things certain ways. They have a big set of FAR rules and DFAR rules they need to follow. So the more they can be involved, I generally see them being very appreciative of that. And they're more, okay, this is somewhat novel, but no, that I really see that, and this is, in my view, probably a year or two away, becoming much more mainstream, is that becomes the pod, the program manager. You're going to get, typically in larger programs, you're going to get a systems integrator, you're going to get some sort of contractor involved to help staff aug and other things. You're going to get the owners of those other systems. So I think of we'll do a lot of workflow automation that'll intersect with or interface with GIS systems. Systems have a ton of information in them that you would think is business rules. Those are business rules, a lot of different layers and decisions that get made in those. Good example of where you need to bring in sort of the owners of those different systems to be a part of that journey. I think the real revolution in AI, and certainly at Pega for our blueprint technology, where from design time AI is, you don't have to spend weeks and months anymore as part of those Scrum meetings. You can come in for half a day periodically because that part of ideation, piloting, and modeling is happening so quickly. You can step back and be like, yeah, that would work. Yeah, we could support that. Or I see what you're doing. When it comes time to ATO, count me on. I'll get someone assigned to this. Where I see a real slowdown, and actually this is getting back to my dropping things on the front porch of IT analogy, is if you don't involve people, you're going to create point solutions, which I still see a lot of in government. You're going to quickly modernize one small thing that is going to actually have upstream and downstream impact, but is going to be perfect for you. And I think that's the new chaos that's coming that hopefully we're going to be able to tame. I just get worried that there's going to be a lot of, I was sitting home like me building my app. There's going to be a lot of, I was sitting home on Saturday, I built this new app and it's going to sit there and do one tiny thing. And that's all it's going to do. And it's going to be one more thing to modernize in 5 years.
And I absolutely agree with that statement and that sentiment. And I would say that is common and something that I see all the time is there's no real thought given to, could this have a wider use? Could this have a wider benefit? Could this be a greater service to the service that I'm a part of? And one example I'll just bring up is I can't think of an installation or an organization, an agency that doesn't have their own little small business database that is like their Microsoft Form or their Excel tool that they're so proud of, but they don't share that outside of their organization. And it's for any given reason, it might be they've got different needs, or I think it works really great for us and I don't want to share because it's my toy and it's shiny. And yeah, for any given reason, I think that there could be a lot more benefit derived from even small and pilot projects like one sort of point solutions. If the folks that are involved in creating them and that are involved in the passion driving the utilization of them, if they just gave a little bit more thought to, could this be useful elsewhere? Could this help somebody else in their job? And not having the just sense to keep it to themselves and to reserve the rights of usage to themselves, but to give everybody an opportunity who could benefit from it, give them the opportunity to leverage it.
Yeah, I agree with you in one sense, and I maybe disagree a little bit in another, in that most of the pushback on sharing those systems, I don't typically see ill intent. It's usually a real concern around, I don't know what you're going to do with this information. I'm ultimately the owner of this particular system of record. And I think back many years ago now, when I was in state government, I wanted to do was working in health and human services, and we wanted to do a longitudinal study where you could actually kind of track K to 12 and then tie it to workforce outcomes. So it was effectively a student ID you wanted to tie to a social security number. We actually couldn't do it. And it wasn't because both of the commissioners, secretaries didn't want to do it. It's that policy didn't actually allow that to happen. So part of where I think we're reasserting with these powerful tools, I think is we're using AI and other tools to integrate an MCP across a lot of different agents and models, is to start getting a lot smarter and nuanced about what does security look like? How do we actually look at who's in that system of record? How do we make sure that if I'm going to give you access, Chelsea, to this information, and I'm going to allow you to use this to drive better outcomes, I'm supportive, but this is more than just an MOU. I'm going to build in an interface in it and some safeguards to make sure that how you're using it is actually in line with our agreement. So I think if we can do that, that's largely how this stuff scales, because you've broken down any of the risk, data spillage, and compliance issues around that.
And I like that. Thinking about data usage and compliance first and getting some of those agreements and some understandings out of the way before just jumping in and sending it out to all your friends, that's probably a good idea.
Yeah, and policy as well. If there are discrete policy things preventing you from getting better outcomes by tying into another system or piece of data, let's get a rapid way to bring those up. Let's go through some rulemaking if that's required and quickly get around because if sharing data, in your case around small business, is going to allow small business to grow faster or more businesses to start in the US, heck yeah, everyone can agree with that.
Yeah, exactly. This has been, first of all, a fantastic conversation. So thank you so much for joining me today. But if people want to know more about what you're doing or more about Pega, or just want to reach out and have a conversation about AI utilization within the federal government or even state and local, how can they get a hold of you?
Yeah, probably the easiest is DM me on LinkedIn. DB Averill is my handle there, or doug.averill@pega.com. Would love to chat. And check out Pega Blueprint, because design time AI is where the world is going, in my view. And again, it's technology is one important part, but the real key in this is how do we take amazing technology with people and reimagine those processes and the procurement that comes with it? Because if we're not getting outcomes, what are we actually doing with it?
Exactly. And that's a great line to finish up on. So I really appreciate you joining the show today. It's been a fantastic conversation. I hope you have a great rest of your week, and I look forward to getting this episode out to the viewers.
Thanks, Jesse. Take it easy.
All right. Thanks, everyone, for listening this week to GovCon Unscripted. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, get this podcast in the ears of your friends, and do your part. Leave a heart. And if you feel so inclined, leave a comment on Spotify or Apple or Amazon or wherever you feel so inclined, and we'll get back to you. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to this episode of GovCon Unscripted with your host, Chelsea Roberts. Do you have a GovCon story or need guidance in government contracting? Connect with Chelsea on LinkedIn to be a guest on the show or to enhance your business strategy. Don't forget, your network is your net worth. If you liked what you heard, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with your growing GovCon community.